So what I'm going to take us through now is 3 steps to solving the threat assessment puzzle. I'm going to break it down for you exactly what it is that you need to do from today to stay safe. But I want to give you a real life example. I've doctored the sort of the names and locations a little bit, but this is a real life example that I helped one of my clients through within the last 4 weeks. We went through this process within the last 4 weeks on this exact scenario. So there's lots of conflict that we can have in houses of worship. There's lots of threats that we need to assess to work out, well, how credible is it? How to draw it to a conclusion? But this is actually very common in today's world. And we had, for this example, which I've sort of changed to protect the innocent, if you like, is a middle-aged man living in Texas, and he's making the allegation that he's been abused by an Episcopal priest in Minnesota in the 1970s, and he goes on to make physical threats. I am going to come to a church and kill the person responsible. I'm going to come to a church and cause harm. You are not taking my complaint seriously. You are not moving the investigation quick enough. And you can see the type of comments this person was making. All what I'm telling you are real statements. So now, when we record that bullseye, think in your mind right now, how would you be assessing this threat or what this individual's saying to make sure that you're hitting the bullseye as opposed to you hitting all across the board? I'm sure you're thinking in your mind, well, Simon, we wouldn't be equipped to deal with this. I wouldn't know where to start. And again, that's why Lee's got me into this training. We're going to take you through it step by step. So keep this case study at the top of your mind as we go through it. Well, the first thing that we need to do when we get these threats is know that we're not alone. Now, Jesus was the biggest team player out there, and he had his 12 disciples. Now, when we're trying to assess threats, we need to build a multidisciplinary threat assessment team that can help us gather all the information and ascertain, could the person cause us harm? Remember, not did the person make a threat, but could the behaviors cause us harm? It's a different way we're going to look at it. So the first thing that we need to do is create this multidisciplinary threat assessment team. And we need to define what is the purpose, what is the goal. So the purpose and the goal is to get a group of individuals that can understand the situation, and they can take that situation for a risk assessment where ultimately we have to make a decision, because you've heard the statement before, to decide is to decide. By burying your head in the sand, having willful blindness, well, that is a decision which will be held accountable by law. So we're going to define the team's purpose, that these individuals, when we have a threat, they're going to get together and they're going to help us work through the threat to conclusion. I'm going to teach you how to do that in a few moments. So when we're identifying who our team is, I said multidisciplinary team, and we need that for a variety of reasons. We need people that are in law enforcement. We need people that work with mental illness. We need people that are health professionals. We need people that understand risk management. So we're going to look at this problem from a lot of different unique perspectives that some people may not have thought of before. And everyone's going to bring different skills and attributes to the table. So when we're thinking about, well, if we got a threat like this, an allegation that someone's been sexually abused by a priest, how are we going to bring this to resolve? What type of people do we want on our team? So I'm sure now, as you're thinking about this, as I've mentioned those roles, I expect you're thinking of 2 or 3 names where you're thinking, I know this person works in mental health within our faith community. I know this person's retired law enforcement. I know this person works in social care. I know this person's on our safety team. These would be a great group of individuals to have a great conversation and try and work through one of these threats. So once you have those names, you just got to approach them and say, what we need to do is this. We know there's so much hurt, there's so much pain, and we're seeing these tragedies strike across the US. And we want to do something about it. But when threats are received within our faith community, We want to create a team which is going to be able to understand what the information is and make a decision as to how do we best keep our people safe. I would love to invite you to be on this team. And here's the commitment. It could be 5 minutes a month. It could be an hour a month. All we're going to do is if there's a threat towards the church, we're going to get together, and I just want your skills and experiences and knowledge to help us work through this problem. Is that something that you feel you could do? I think you'll find if you have that question, most people will say, yes, Simon, I'm happily to get involved. Let me know what it is that you need from me. Now, the last thing that we need to do is once we've built this team, we need to train them on what the system is. So we need a way that can be sustainable and is repeatable through the steps. So we do need to train people, but training is going to come a little bit later once I'm going to tell you how we're actually going to assess these threats. But we've got to make sure that team stays trained. So I'm now going to take us through the threat assessment process. Now, what does this look like? So let's go back to my client that approached me and said, Simon, we have a person in Texas who is making an allegation that they were sexually abused by one of our priests in the 1970s. All the names that they put forward are actually deceased. There is no one living. However, this person is making threats that they might come to Minnesota, they might cause us harm, and they might go to the press, they might do all these various different things. So the first thing that we need to do when we get a sort of a threat, we get a risk, we need to gather up the information. So you can see on the screen here is about what do we know of the person concerned and their history of violence. What I did for my client was we hired a private detective in Texas to dig into the background a little bit and learn out, well, what were the convictions? What does this person do for work? What car do they drive? Do they have the money and funds to jump on a plane or get in the car and drive here? Tell us everything that you know about their background. So we did what we call open source information. If you hadn't heard that before, open source is doing internet research, which anyone can find is searchable. And then I paid for a private detective to find out some more information to ascertain who is this person, what do we know about them. And so then once we had all that information, you might just use Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, a Google search. You might ask people in the community. There's other ways that you might gather information. You then got to look at the risk factors. So we had a gentleman, as it turns out, was living with his 92-year-old mother. He was unemployed. He drove a 19-year-old car. The apartment they were living in was, I believe, 900 square feet. And we believe that he was sleeping on the couch. He had been arrested previously, but a lot of those were physical convictions. However, they went back sort of 10, 15 years. And then when we tried to find out, did he have a firearm? When he was in Texas, and everyone in Texas has a firearm, so it's really difficult to manage. So we looked at all the risk factors. His access to weapons, his history of substance abuse was in his background, but a long time ago. His history of violence. He had a history of violence. He had convictions for assault, but they were going back 10, 15 years. So we looked at the risk factors. And then ultimately what we had to do is then evaluate all the information to work out, well, we've got this guy in Texas. He's making an allegation against the Episcopal Church here in Minnesota. He's alleging he's been sexually abused. The church have reported it to law enforcement who are investigating it. Everyone that he's talking about is deceased. He's been told that these people are deceased. And we're trying to work out, will he really get on the plane and come to Minnesota? Will he get in his car? Does he have the means? We have to evaluate the risk. And if you've not seen this before, this is just a very simple process that I take my church clients through. And at the end, I'll tell you how you can have access to these slides. So if you're making notes, you don't necessarily need to, because I will give you access to these slides afterwards. But this is just a very simple heat map between likelihood and impact. So I've told you the story. I've told you what we understand about this gentleman. We have to somehow categorize the risk. So we just use a basic heat map like this to say, we look at the likelihood. Is it likely that he will get on a plane and come to Minnesota? Is it likely that he will drive to Minnesota? Most probably unlikely right now because he's unemployed. He lives with his mother. He drives a 20-year-old vehicle, or he is a man of limited means. He's been told that people are deceased, but he's got the anger and hurt with. And yes, he's making threats, but at this stage, it's most probably unlikely that he's going to come to Minnesota based off the information that we've gathered and what law enforcement told us, but it doesn't really look like he's left a sort of a 20 square mile of where he lives. But if he was to come, what would be the impact if he carried out some of the things that he said, but he's going to cause the community harm? Most probably major. So we take our heat map and we say, well, it's unlikely that he is going to come, but if he did come, the level of harm we could cause would be major. So we put it on our heat map as being moderate. So we're going to say this is a moderate risk. So once we know this, we've got a way to categorize it now, and we can say how we got there. We looked at the likelihood and the impact. We look at the information, and now we're going to consult with the experts. We're doing this with our threat assessment team. We're going to talk to law enforcement. We're going to talk to health professionals. We're going to talk to a broader perspective, an individual, to try and ascertain, are we doing the right thing? Did we categorize the risk in the right location? How we sort of got it on the heat map in the right area? Do we feel that we know everything? Have we got something that we can articulate to someone as to why we came by the decision that we did? And taking you through what I've done so far, we can, because we can say that we had the threat, we investigated the threat, I hired a private detective, we did some open source information, we learned about his criminal history, we read the letters that he was writing in allegations, we read the letters back to him, we heard what he was saying, and as a result of all that, we put it as being moderate, and then here is how we responded. So we're going to consult with those experts. And so now we've categorized our risk, and we can say, yep, Simon, this is a moderate risk. Well, what does that then mean? What do we do to move this forward? Well, we now need to build our risk management plan or our risk management strategy. So this is where we're going to implement safety measures based off the risk, which is immediate. So we're going to take those immediate steps to ensure the safety of our church and community. Now, depending where you are or your faith community, some of these things might be quite controversial for you, but it's not uncommon for churches to trespass people that are saying that they're going to cause harm against them. It's not uncommon to issue non-contact orders for those repeat offenders that continually come to a church and cause the church community problems. It could be that we're going to increase our physical security measures for the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks by locking our doors, or by having a guest, a volunteer on our doors to greet every person, looking for this individual should he travel up from Texas. We're going to have a means to sort of identify him, and we're going to put some security measures in place. So if you wanted to, when we go back to the heat map for a second here, you could, between very low, moderate, high, critical, you could build your own framework as to what are some of those action steps that you take each time, so you're consistent, you have a sustainable program as to what you are going to do. Now, we spoke about physical security, we spoke about issuing non-contact orders, we spoke about restraining orders. It could be that you might want to monitor the individual. So if this individual was local, can anyone think of a group who could cause potential harm to our church body, where we might want to say to them, it's okay for you to come to a church, but when you come to a church, you need to notify us of your arrival and someone is going to be with you. Quickly in the chat, can anyone think of a group a demographic of church believers that might come to a church where we might want to say to them, when you arrive, let us know. Yep, Trenna, and we've got Eric, Daniel, Robert, great answer, sex offenders. So again, some of these things might be new to you. You might say, we've never done this in my church. But again, it's very common when I work with churches, taking them through this threat assessment, and we go to the heat map, we might say, one of the things that we need to do is to monitor this individual. So they're welcome to come to our church. We want them to be led to Christ. We want them to repent their sins, believing that everyone can be saved. There's no sin that our God cannot forgive. However, you're critical on our heat map, which means that you need to tell us when you're going to come to a church, which means that someone's going to sit next to you, which means you have no access to children. So we might want to, within our plan, our risk management plan strategy, we might want to monitor the individual. Something that we shouldn't forget is that because we are a church, we do want to provide support for these individuals. So it could be someone now that's made a threat, they've got mental illness, and they're unhappy with the church, and they're saying, I'm going to come and get someone at the church. Well, if someone's got mental illness and they might be making threats and allegations towards the church, it doesn't mean we want to welcome it into a church with open arms, because we've got people we need to keep safe. However, we might be able to minister to those people outside of the church body. And I talk a lot to pastors about this when they have a sex offender within their community and they still want them to come to church. I say that's great, but maybe let's meet that person at a coffee shop Monday or Tuesday, and you can talk them through your sermon, you can talk them through your notes, or someone can meet with them outside of a church. So we're going to provide support to those people that could be demonstrating a pathway, because we believe in crisis intervention. We believe in de-escalation. We believe there's a way to lead people to the Lord where they can be saved and they can seek the services that they need so they don't carry out that mass attack. So we're not going to lose sight of, within our risk management strategy, within that strategy is going to be ways, well, how do we help this person? How do we come alongside this person? How do we minister to them? Because yes, they're demonstrating behaviors and they're saying things which could indicate they're on a pathway to violence, but we've also got to provide them with support. And then the last thing that we're going to do within our risk management strategy is we are going to talk to local police, mental health practitioners, outside agencies, inform them of what's going on, make sure that we've reported any criminal activity if we need to. Using my example, we reported it to the local police that this person in Texas is making an allegation that they were sexually abused as a child by someone within our church body. And here's how we've categorized it. Here's what we know. And here's how we're going to respond. So we are going to make sure that we're working and collaborating with our law enforcement, because law enforcement, they are our public defenders. They are one of our lines of defense. So we want to make sure we're not excluding them when we're doing our threat assessment process. But we get a lot of threats within our house of worship, don't we? We get a lot of things that can go wrong. We have to take some personal accountability. So we're going to take them through this threat assessment process. And then the last thing, which is crucial when we are evaluating threats, is to make sure we document the process. Now, I spoke about this on a webinar a few weeks ago, and someone said, well, Simon, what happens if that person does get in his car and drives from Texas and comes to one of those churches and assaults the pastor, or worse still, carries out a deadly attack? Are we responsible? Well, here's what we've done. We understood that there was a risk to our church community, to our church body. We went through this process of where we gathered information to try and find out everything that we can about this individual to ascertain how likely is it that this person is going to follow through in what they're going to do. On our heat map, we then said it's a moderate risk. From a moderate risk, we then, for the next 2 weeks, stationed someone on the door. We then, for the next 2 weeks, gave this person's photograph to little Maggie, who sits on our front desk, and said, if you see that person, let us know. We told law enforcement, we put all these things in place to try and keep ourselves safe. We engaged Simon at Kingswood as a consultant to help us. We notified law enforcement, and then we documented that process. So later on, as we always do, the Monday morning quarterbacks that we often hear, and when these things get analysed, and there's all these indicators, as I mentioned, no one just snaps. There's always warning signs. Yes, something harmful might happen, but we can show people, we can demonstrate to them how we've been very effective in trying to identify and mitigate our risk. And we did everything possible that we could do to keep our church community safe. So we need to document that process, how we came by our risk decision, and how we came by how long we're going to do things for. We can only station a volunteer to the doors to the church for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. We can't do that for 52 weeks of a year based off this one. There might be another way to look at it. So after 5 weeks, we said we're not going to have that person there. The 6th week, that person comes in and assaults someone. However, how long do we do this for before we've got to move on? So these are very challenging times, but hopefully you can see that if you put a framework around this, it's a repeatable process where you can then articulate to someone, this is how we came by the decision that we did. So I want to talk a little bit now on the rinse and repeat. So once we've got this example, you can then remove the person who's made an allegation who's been sexually abused. You can then insert the next most popular question that I get is little Maggie on the front desk is going through a divorce. Her soon-to-be ex-husband is very angry and he's threatening to come to the church. Simon, what do we do? Well, again, I get the Simon, what do we do? Because we've got to build this threat assessment process. We've got to look at, well, little Maggie's soon-to-be ex-husband. What did he say? Has he done anything like this before? Risk factors. Does he have access to firearms? How likely is it that he's going to come to the church at 2:00 on a Tuesday and he's going to have it out with Maggie? What does Maggie say about that? Does Maggie feel that he's truly going to come here? Yes or no? Well, no. Maggie's just letting us know he's done this 10 times before. He blows hot air. However, there is a chance that he might come. Okay, so that's great. So we can then put that as maybe a moderate or a minor risk. But what we're going to do is that we're going to lock the doors to the church for the next 2 weeks. And then anyone who comes has got to press the buzzer. We're still an open door church. Everyone's welcome, but they've got to press the buzzer. We can see who it is, and then we're going to let them in. That's how we're going to mitigate this threat. So you can see that you can really remove the story and just insert a new story in. And then you can go through that process of information gathering. Then you can then go through assessing the threat and then building your risk assessment strategy, your management plan, and then documenting that down. Now, this is a little bit, I don't want to swear, but this is a little bit damned if you do, damned if you don't, because there's always the unknown. However, you will be able to show someone that you went through a very clear and articulate thought process to get to the conclusion that you did.